50 degrees below zero clawed at the thin aluminum skin of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Yet agonizing sweat stung Captain Thomas Hayes's eyes. He gripped the heavy yoke of A*52, feeling the 60-ton Leviathan shudder violently against the turbulent stratospheric winds. Pushing toward Tokyo at 28,000 feet, the bomber carried 6 tons of incendiaries and 11 deeply terrified, fiercely resolute men. Absolute silence ruled the intercom. Every crewman aboard understood the desperation mathematics of the empire waiting below. In this unforgiving expanse of the Pacific sky, survival was never a guarantee. It was a brutal commodity, bought only with lead and violent resolve. Isley Field on Saipan was a coral dust nightmare, a jagged gash of American engineering carved into a recently conquered island. On the early morning of the 27th of January 1945, the darkness was absolute, save for the harsh glare of Klieg lights illuminating the silver flanks of the 497th Bombardment Group's fleet. A*52 sat heavy on her tricycle landing gear. A bloated silver whale, pregnant with 6 tons of incendiaries and high explosives. At 99 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet, the B-29 was the most technologically advanced war machine ever built, a marvel of aluminum, wiring, and lethal intent. Captain Tommy Hayes, walked beneath the colossal bomb bay doors, his flashlight beam tracing the riveted seams of the fuselage. At 26, Hayes had the weathered, exhausted face of a much older man. He had flown B-17s over Europe, but the Pacific was a different beast entirely. Here, there was no friendly territory to limp towards if things went wrong. There was only the endless, dark water. "Engines look tight, Cap," Master Sergeant William Bill Gallagher called out from the shadows near the starboard wing. Gallagher was the flight engineer, the man responsible for coaxing the notoriously temperamental Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines into keeping them aloft. The engines were a brilliant design, but prone to overheating and swallowing valves, especially under the immense strain of a max-weight takeoff in tropical heat. "Let's hope they stay that way, Bill," Hayes replied, clicking his flashlight off. "We're carrying max fuel today. If we lose an engine before we hit 1,000 feet, we're going to be swimming with a very large fireball." Inside the pressurized cabin, the air was thick with the smell of canvas, sweat, and high-octane aviation fuel. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, 22 years old, and the youngest man on the crew, climbed into the central fire control compartment. Chen was a slight, quiet man from California, possessing an unnatural calm that made him perfect for the CFC position. He settled into the elevated barber-style chair beneath the top plexiglass blister, surrounded by the glow of the General Electric analog computers. The B-29 didn't have waist gunners standing in open windows, like the older, flying Fortresses. It was fully pressurized. Chen and the other gunners sat in the warm cabin aiming their twin, 50 caliber machine guns, remotely using complex optical sights. When Chen moved his sight, electrical signals raced through the bomber's nervous system, directing the external turrets to match his movements. The analog computers automatically compensated for airspeed, gravity, temperature, and lead. It was science fiction made real, but it only worked if the man looking through the glass had ice in his veins. By 0600 hours, Isley Field was a deafening symphony of mechanical roars. 62 B-29 SLES were spooling up their massive 4-bladed propellers, churning the humid air into a blinding storm of coral dust. Hayes pushed the throttles forward. A*52 groaned, the brakes squealing in protest before he released them. The bomber lumbered down the runway, fighting for every inch of speed. 70 miles per hour, 90, 110. The end of the runway, and the sheer drop to the ocean below, was rushing up at terrifying speed. "Come on, you heavy bitch," Hayes muttered, pulling back on the heavy yoke. First Lieutenant Acheron Sterling, the co-pilot, had his hands hovering over the engine fire extinguishers, his knuckles white. With agonizing slowness, the nose wheel lifted. Then the main gear detached from the coral. A square 5-2 clawed her way into the pre-dawn sky, immediately beginning the long, slow, grinding climb to 28,000 feet. The journey north across the Pacific took hours. As they gained altitude, the tropical heat of Saipan faded, replaced by the lethal cold of the stratosphere. The outside temperature plummeted to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Even inside the pressurized tube, frost began to spiderweb across the edges of the plexiglass blisters. Chen rubbed his gloved hands together, adjusting his oxygen mask. He had flown 11 combat missions over the Japanese home islands. He had fired thousands of rounds into the blinding blue sky, tracking targets until his eyes burned. But he had 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese fighters were agile, terrifyingly fast, and piloted by men defending their homes. "Navigator to pilot," the intercom crackled. The voice of Second Lieutenant David "Doc" Harrison, cutting through the drone of the 4 immense engines. "We are 100 miles out from landfall. I'm picking up strong tailwinds. Adjusting ETA to target by -4 minutes." "Copy that, Doc," Hayes replied. "Gunners, listen up. Intelligence says the 47th Sentai out of Naramasu has been heavily reinforced. They know we're coming. Clear your guns and keep your eyes peeled. We are entering the meat grinder." In the CFC blister, Chen swiveled his chair. Through the clear dome, he could see the rest of the formation, a staggered, geometric array of silver crosses against the deep, bruised purple of the high-altitude sky. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. They were an armada of destruction, bringing the wrath of an awakened nation to the doorstep of an empire. But as Chen peered toward the northern horizon, the beauty faded. A thin, dark smudge was growing against the distant clouds. The interceptors were rising. The Japanese early warning radar at Cape Anubo had picked up the American armada long before the B-29S saw the coastline. By the time A square 5-2 crossed over the shoreline south of Tokyo Bay, the sky was already seeded with danger. "Bogies at 12 o'clock high," shouted Sergeant Joseph Joey Russo from his isolated, pressurized tail gunner compartment. "I count at least. Jesus, I count 40 of them. They're swarming like angry hornets." Through the upper blister, Chen saw them. They were Nakajima Ki 44 Tojo interceptors, single-engine fighters designed specifically for high-altitude bomber interception. They didn't bother with the intricate dogfighting maneuvers of the earlier Zero. The Tojo was a blunt instrument, built to climb fast, hit hard, and dive away. "CFC tracking," Chen reported into his throat mic, his voice betraying none of the adrenaline flooding his system. He gripped the dual handles of his optical sight. His thumbs rested lightly on the firing triggers. He engaged the primary command switch, taking control of both the upper forward and upper aft turrets. 4 50 caliber machine guns swung upward, locking onto the coordinates his sight dictated. The first wave of Tojos didn't attack horizontally. They utilized a tactic the Americans had learned to dread: the frontal diving pass. A formation of 4 fighters rolled inverted at 32,000 feet, entirely above the bomber stream, and plummeted straight down. "Here they come!" Acheron Sterling yelled from the cockpit, his eyes wide as the leading fighter grew from a speck into a terrifyingly detailed machine. The radial engine cowling of the Ki 44 seemed to swallow the sky. Flames erupted from the fighter's wing roots as its cannons opened up. Tracers, glowing arcs of deadly red light, whipped past the cockpit of A square 5-2, inches away from the glass. The sound of the enemy cannons was drowned out by the thunderous roar of the B-29's own defensive fire. Chen had his reticle over the lead diving fighter. He waited, letting the analog computer calculate the insane closure rate of nearly 600 miles per hour. The mechanical gears within the black box by his feet whirred and clicked. Wait! When the Tojo filled the illuminated ring of his sight, Chen squeezed the triggers. The airframe of the Superfortress shuddered violently as the upper turrets spat a continuous stream of armor-piercing, incendiary rounds. Because of the computer's lead calculations, Chen wasn't aiming at the fighter. He was aiming at empty space, filling a volumetric box that the fighter was about to occupy. The Ki-44 flew straight into the wall of lead. Chen watched through the magnified optic as the fighter's engine cowling simply disintegrated. Panels of aluminum shredded away like wet paper. A bright, blinding flash of orange fire erupted from the Tojo's fuel tank, and the aircraft snapped violently to the right, tumbling out of control in a chaotic, smoking death spiral. "Got him!" "Target destroyed," Chen yelled, the thrill of his first confirmed kill washing over him for a microsecond before training took back over. There was no time to celebrate. The sky had shattered into absolute chaos. Over the next 12 minutes, A*52 became the center of a maelstrom. The disciplined American formation began to stretch and flex under the intense pressure of the 47th Sentai's assault. Bombers buffeted in the turbulent slipstreams of exploding fighters. Black puffs of heavy anti-aircraft flak began to blossom around them as they neared the initial point for their bomb run. "Target at 3 o'clock level," barked Hank Miller, the radio operator, peering through his small side window. Chen disengaged the upper aft turret, leaving it to the side gunners, and swung his sight right. A Tojo was making a high-speed slashing attack, trying to rake the bomber's long wings. Chen pressed the triggers. A 3-second burst traced a line of devastation across the fighter's cockpit canopy. The enemy plane pitched up sharply, stalled, and fell away, trailing thick black smoke. Kill number 2, but for every fighter they knocked down, 3 more seemed to take its place. The Japanese pilots were fighting with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They were defending their capital, their families, their emperor. They pressed their attacks closer than ever before, flying through the concentrated crossfire of the B-29 formation with a suicidal disregard for their own lives. "Left waist gunners jammed," came a frantic call over the intercom. "Clear it manually." "Hurry," Hayes ordered, his voice tight. In the cockpit, Hayes and Sterling were fighting the controls. The B-29 was heavy and sluggish, requiring immense physical strength to maintain formation. If they dropped out of the protective box, they would be singled out and butchered. Then, the unthinkable happened. A lone Ki-44, already damaged and trailing a thin ribbon of glycol smoke from a previous pass, swung around in a wide arc. It positioned itself at 12 o'clock high, directly in front of A*52. Chen swung his sight toward it. Target 12 o'clock high, coming in fast. He fired. The tracers hammered into the nose of the incoming fighter. Pieces of the enemy plane chipped off, glittering in the high-altitude sun. But the fighter didn't veer away. It didn't attempt an evasive break. Its guns remained silent. It had expended all its ammunition. Chen held the triggers down until his barrels were glowing cherry red, screaming over the intercom, "He's not breaking! He's not breaking!" The Japanese pilot was not engaging in a conventional attack. This was the desperation mathematics of a dying empire. The pilot had made his final calculation, his life, and a damaged fighter in exchange for an American heavy bomber. "Brace for impact," Hayes roared over the intercom, throwing his arms up over his face. The impact was a cataclysmic, deafening explosion of tearing metal and shattered glass that defied description. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical shockwave that punched through the heavily armored fuselage of the B-29. The Japanese fighter, weighing over 5,000 pounds and traveling at 400 miles per hour, slammed directly into the right wing of A*52, right between the number 3 and number 4 engines. Inside the cabin, the crew was thrown violently against their harnesses. Chen's head slammed against the edge of his optical sight, his vision exploding into a constellation of white stars. The pressurized cabin instantly lost its integrity with a violent, screaming whoosh as the seal ruptured somewhere in the aft section. A blinding fog of freezing condensation instantly filled the compartment as the -50-degree air violently invaded the cabin. "Oxygen! Masks tight! We're depressurized!" Gallagher yelled over the roaring wind, scrambling back to his engineer's panel, which was now lit up like a Christmas tree of catastrophic failures. A. Square. 5. 2 violently yawed to the right, the massive starboard wing buckling under the kinetic strike. The remains of the Tojo had disintegrated upon impact, but its engine block had smashed through the B-29's leading edge, severing hydraulic lines, fuel mains, and electrical conduits. "Engine 3 is gone. Fire on Engine 4, Gallagher screamed, his hands flying across the bewildering array of switches and levers. "Feathering 3. Hitting the extinguisher on 4. Hayes wrestled with the yoke, his biceps bulging beneath his heavy flight jacket. It was like trying to steer a runaway freight train with a broken steering wheel. "Acheron, help me. Stand on that left rudder. Push." Sterling drove his heavy fleece-lined boot into the left rudder pedal with all his might, trying to counteract the massive drag now pulling the bomber to the right. The bomber groaned, the metal airframe complaining under aerodynamic loads it was never designed to survive. Through his cracked plexiglass dome, Chen looked to the right. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. The entire right wing was a jagged, smoking ruin. The number 3 propeller was windmilling uselessly, and the number 4 engine cowling was blackened, coughing thick, oily smoke that trailed behind them like a mourning shroud. "We're falling out of formation," Doc Harrison called out from the navigator's desk, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos. It was true. Stripped of the power of its 2 starboard engines, A. Square 5-2 could no longer maintain the 250-mile-per-hour cruising speed of the bomber stream. The silver armada of their brethren slowly pulled away, leaving them isolated in the hostile sky. Standard Army Air Force's doctrine was mercilessly clear. A B-29, with 2 engines, gone on the same side, was fundamentally unflyable. The crew was supposed to hit the bailout bell, unseal the bomb bay doors, and jump into the freezing void, hoping the Japanese ground forces below would take them prisoner rather than execute them on the spot. "Captain, we're losing altitude fast," Sterling said, his voice tight with panic. "We need to ring the bell." Hayes gritted his teeth, his eyes locked on the artificial horizon, which was dangerously tilted. "No. If we jump over Tokyo, we're dead men." "Bill, can you keep Engine 4 from exploding?" "I cut the fuel flow to the fire, but it's producing 0 thrust, Cap. We're flying on 2 engines." Before Hayes could formulate a plan, the intercom erupted again. "Fighters! They see us! They're swarming!" Russo yelled from the tail. The Japanese pilots circling above recognized a mortally wounded animal when they saw one. A crippled B-29, dropping out of the combat box, was the ultimate prize. Like sharks scenting blood, a half-dozen Tojos broke off from the main engagement and dove toward the solitary, smoking Superfortress. Chen wiped a smear of blood from his forehead, his vision clearing. He grabbed the handles of his sight, CFC tracking. "Stay on the guns, boys. If we're going down, we're taking every last one of these bastards with us." He swung the top turrets toward an incoming fighter. The analog computer was struggling. The B-29 was crabbing sideways through the air, completely throwing off the gyroscopes and airspeed inputs the computer relied upon. Chen realized instantly that the automated lead calculation was wrong. He switched the system to manual override, relying entirely on his own raw instinct and tracer observation. He fired a burst. The tracers arced beautifully, stitching into the left wing of an incoming Tojo. The fighter snapped a wing spar and spiraled away. Kill number 3, but there were too many. Another fighter, recognizing the sluggishness of the bomber, lined up for a dead astern pass. "Joey, tail gun. Take him," Chen yelled. "My turret's jammed. The impact warped the tracks," Russo screamed back. "I have no guns." The Japanese fighter closed the distance. The pilot, perhaps emboldened by the lack of return fire from the tail, decided not to fire his weapons. Instead, he opened his throttle to maximum, aligning his spinner directly with the enormous vertical stabilizer of the B-29. "He's going to ram. Second rammer. Brace." The second impact was a sickening, crunching thud that resonated through the floorboards. The Tojo slammed into the port side, near the waist section, tearing away a massive chunk of the aluminum skin and severely damaging the number 1 engine on the left wing. The fighter then tumbled backward, its pilot undoubtedly killed instantly, leaving A square 52 inches an utterly catastrophic state. 2 engines, completely dead, on the right. 1 engine critically damaged on the left. Only the number 2 engine was operating at full power. The bomber was effectively a 60-ton brick, with a single propeller pulling it through the sky. The bomber immediately dropped into a steep, terrifying dive. The altimeter spun wildly backward, 25,000 feet, 22,000, 19,000. "Mayday, mayday, this is A, square, 52, we are going down," Miller chanted into his radio, though the antenna had likely been sheared off. Inside the cockpit, Hayes and Sterling were practically standing on the rudder pedals, pulling the yokes into their chests with the strength of desperate men. "Pull, pull," Hayes screamed, his vocal cords tearing. The bomber fell through the cloud layer, the ground of Japan rushing up to meet them. And then, miraculously, the thick, dense air of the lower altitudes gave the massive wings just enough lift. At barely 8,000 feet, the descent slowed. The bomber leveled out, shuddering violently, hanging in the air by nothing more than the aerodynamic equivalent of a thread and the sheer, unyielding willpower of the men in the cockpit. "We're level," Sterling gasped, his chest heaving. "We're level, Cap." "Don't celebrate yet," Hayes rasped, sweat freezing to his face in the depressurized cabin. "We still have our bombs. We have 1 good engine, and we are 1,000 miles from home." Up in the CFC blister, Chen looked at the radar repeater. He expected the sky to be clear. He expected the Japanese to assume they had crashed. Instead, the screen was peppered with dots. Because they had dropped so low, so fast, they had fallen right into the lap of a secondary fighter patrol that had been circling at medium altitude. The Japanese pilots looked up and saw a miracle. An American Superfortress, smoking, crippled, flying at a snail's pace of barely 140 miles per hour. It was an unmissable target. "Captain," Chen said quietly over the intercom, his voice devoid of panic, replaced by a terrifying, absolute calm. "We have company. At least a dozen fighters inbound." Hayes didn't hesitate. "Salvo the bombs. Drop them right here. We need the weight gone." "Bomb bay doors won't open," Gallagher yelled. The hydraulic lines were severed in the second ramming. They were stuck with 6 tons of bombs, 3 dead engines, and a swarm of fresh fighters closing in. Standard doctrine said they were dead. Every tactical manual, printed by the Army Air Forces, dictated that survival under these conditions was mathematically impossible. But as the first Japanese fighter banked in for a kill shot, expecting an easy, helpless target, Chen realized something profound. The manuals were based on a B-29, flying straight and level, at 250 miles per hour. A square 52 was crabbing sideways, slipping through the air erratically at incredibly low speed. The Japanese fighters were coming in far too fast. Their pilots were accustomed to intercepting fast-moving bombers at high altitude. Down here, against a crippled, slow-moving target, their closure rates were entirely misjudged. "Gunners, listen to me," Chen ordered, his voice cracking like a whip over the intercom, taking tactical command of the crippled ship's defense. "Forget the computers. Switch to manual. They are going to overshoot us. Wait until they are right on top of you. Wait until they break and shoot them in the belly. We are going to make them bleed." Below the battered smoking belly of A square 52, the jagged coastline of Honshu blurred past. They were flying so low that Captain Thomas Hayes could see the whitecaps on the Pacific waves and the terraced hillsides of the Japanese mainland. The B-29 was a dying leviathan, bleeding hydraulic fluid and oil into the freezing wind. With 2 engines dead on the right wing, 1 critically damaged on the left, and a massive hole torn into its port side from the second ramming, the bomber was practically crawling to the fresh flight of Nakajima-ki 43, Oscar, and Kawasaki-ki 61. Tony fighters circling above, the American Superfortress looked like a floating target range. High above, the flight leader of the Japanese patrol saw the smoking bomber and rolled his Ki 61 into a steep, punishing dive. He was carrying lethal speed, pushing 380 miles per hour. Standard intercept doctrine dictated that a B-29 would be flying straight at 250 miles per hour, meaning a stern attack required a gradual closure rate to aim effectively. But A-52 was staggering through the air at barely 140 miles per hour, yawing wildly to the right, as Hayes and Sterling physically fought the asymmetric thrust of their single good engine. In the central fire control blister, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen watched the incoming fighter grow exponentially in his ring sight. His hands were sweating through his heavy leather gloves. He had completely disconnected the sophisticated General Electric analog computers. The gyros were tumbling. The electronic brains were entirely confused by the bomber's erratic, crabbing flight path. It was down to raw, manual gunnery, man against man, eye against machine. Wait, Chen breathed into the intercom, his voice a steady, chilling anchor in the chaotic static. Wait for it. He's coming in too hot. Left waist, right waist, track him. But do not fire until he fills the glass. Sergeant Tommy Riley, manning the left waist blister, felt the freezing wind howling through the ruptured fuselage. His oxygen mask was caked in frozen condensation, but his eyes were locked on the diving Ki 61. I see him, Robbie. He's burning sky. The Japanese pilot realized his catastrophic error, a fraction of a second too late. Expecting a fast-moving bomber, he had completely misjudged the closure rate. He wasn't just catching up to A-52. He was about to rear-end it at 200 miles per hour. Panicking, the pilot yanked his control stick back, violently braking his dive to avoid a mid-air collision, exposing the unarmored underside of his fighter. Now, take his belly, Chen roared. Chen squeezed the triggers of the upper forward turret. Riley hammered the triggers of the left lower. Without the computer's automated lead, the gunners were firing line of sight, pouring a devastating crossfire directly into the space the fighter was desperately pulling into. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds shredded the soft underbelly of the Ki 61. The fighter's liquid-cooled engine instantly ruptured, spewing a blinding cloud of white glycol. A split second later, the fuel tanks ignited. The fighter didn't just crash. It evaporated into a violently expanding ball of orange fire that washed over the tail of the B-29, scorching the aluminum. Kill confirmed. Good shooting, Tommy, Chen yelled. Kill number 4. But the swarm was relentless. The remaining fighters of the patrol, witnessing the sudden destruction of their leader, abandoned their disciplined formations. They descended upon the crippled Superfortress in a chaotic, swirling melee, driven by a furious cocktail of vengeance and opportunity. 2, coming in from 9 o'clock level, shouted Corporal Danny O'Connor, from the right waist blister. I got the lead, Danny. You take the wingman, Riley fired back. The interior of A-52 became a deafening echo chamber of hammering 50 caliber machine guns. The floorboards vibrated so violently that the gunners' teeth chattered. The air was thick with the acrid, sulfurous stench of burned cordite and the coppery tang of hydraulic fluid. Empty brass casings rained down into the collection bins, like a torrential metallic downpour. Because the B-29 was moving so slowly, the Japanese pilots repeatedly overshot their passes. They would dive, realize they were closing too fast, and sharply pull away, constantly exposing their wings and bellies to the American gunners. Chen, Riley, and O'Connor orchestrated a brutal, intimate defense. They were no longer fighting a sanitized, high-altitude strategic war. They were in a close-quarters street fight in the sky. A Ki-43 Oscar swept in from below, attempting to rake the bomber's bomb bay. Riley tracked it manually, leading the target with pure instinct, and sent a 2-second burst directly through the canopy. The Oscar pitched down sharply and plunged into the sea below. Kill number 5. Seconds later, Chen tracked a fighter, attempting a high-deflection shot from the front. He walked his tracers right through the engine block. The fighter tumbled end over end, tearing itself apart in the slipstream. Kill number 6. Keep pouring it on them, Hayes bellowed from the cockpit, his face a mask of absolute exertion as he stood on the rudder pedals. We're making them pay for every inch. By the 10th minute of the low-altitude engagement, the crew of A*52 had achieved the impossible. Through raw marksmanship and the inadvertent tactical advantage of their crippled speed, they had swatted down 4 more Japanese fighters. The sky was littered with falling debris and blossoming parachutes. Kills 7, 8, 9, and 10 were recorded in a haze of adrenaline and cordite. But the victory was a hollow, desperate one. The B-29 was dying. "Captain!" Master Sergeant William Bill Gallagher's voice cracked over the intercom, cutting through the gunfire. "Engine 2 is redlining. Cylinder head temperatures are off the charts. If we don't reduce drag and weight right now, the engine is going to seize, and we're going into the drink." Hayes looked out the shattered starboard window. They were barely a mile offshore, limping out over the open Pacific. The water below was a cold, slate gray. "Bombardier," Hayes called out. "Dick, we need those 6 tons of incendiaries gone. Salvo the payload." First Lieutenant Richard Dick Powell had been sitting uselessly in the plexiglass nose of the bomber, clutching his Norden bomb sight while the air war raged around him. As the bombardier, he was the master of the payload, but with the hydraulic lines severed in the second ramming, his electronic release toggles were dead plastic. "Captain, the automated system is completely dead," Powell reported, unbuckling his harness and grabbing a portable oxygen bottle. "The bay doors are locked shut. I have to go back there and manually crank them open." "Do it, Dick. Take Gallagher with you," Hayes ordered. "If we don't lose that weight in the next 3 minutes, we're all dead." Gallagher abandoned his flight engineer's panel, his face pale and slick with frozen sweat. He met Powell at the entrance to the unpressurized bomb bay. The narrow, 30-foot-long catwalk that spanned the forward and aft bomb bays was normally a terrifying place to traverse. Now, with the fuselage ruptured and the plane crabbing sideways at 8,000 feet, it was a wind-blasted tunnel of absolute terror. "We have to use the manual hand cranks," Gallagher yelled over the howling slipstream, clipping his safety lanyard to the overhead wire. They stepped out onto the 8-inch-wide aluminum beam. Below them lay 6 tons of M69 incendiary clusters, sitting heavily on the closed doors. The cold was a physical entity, biting through their heavy fleece jackets and instantly numbing their fingers. The roar of the wind, rushing through the gaps in the damaged fuselage, was deafening. Powell reached the forward bulkhead and grabbed the heavy steel hand crank for the forward doors. Gallagher moved carefully past the bomb shackles to reach the aft crank. "On 3, Powell screamed, though he could barely hear himself. 1, 2, 3, turn." They threw their weight into the cranks. The gearing was designed to be turned by mechanics on the ground, not by exhausted men in a freezing, bucking aircraft while under enemy fire. The cranks resisted, groaning against the weight of the bombs resting directly on the doors. In the CFC blister, Chen saw another pair of fighters lining up for a pass. "Incoming! 3 o'clock level. Tommy, Danny, keep them off us. They're trying to hit the wing roots." The waist guns hammered again, the vibration shaking the entire airframe. Out on the catwalk, Powell and Gallagher were thrown against the bomb racks as the bomber shuddered. Powell's knuckles scraped against the icy metal of an incendiary cluster, tearing the leather of his glove and drawing blood. But he didn't stop cranking. "It's jamming!" Gallagher yelled from the aft section. "The right door is warped from the impact. The gears are skipping." Powell looked down. The left bomb bay door had opened a few inches, revealing a sliver of the terrifyingly close ocean below. But the right door, bent and twisted from the sheer kinetic force of the fighter that had rammed their right wing, was locked tight. The bombs couldn't fall. "We have to kick it," Powell roared. He abandoned the crank, gripping the overhead safety wire with both hands. He swung his body out over the void, dangling directly above the live ordnance. With all the strength he could muster, he drove his heavy flight boot down onto the warped hinge of the right bomb bay door. Bang! The metal groaned but didn't yield. Up in the cockpit, Sterling pointed at the engine instruments. "Cap, Engine 2 is losing manifold pressure. We're losing altitude. 7,000 feet, 6,500. Come on, Dick." Hayes prayed aloud, his arms trembling violently as he held the yoke. In the bomb bay, Powell kicked again, and again. Gallagher joined him, stomping on the aft section of the same door. The B-29 pitched violently as an anti-aircraft shell fired from a Japanese destroyer, lurking off the coast, burst 100 yards off their left wing. The concussion slammed the bomber sideways. The sudden violent shift in gravity, combined with the frantic kicking of the two crewmen, was just enough. With a deafening crack of shearing metal, the warped hinge finally gave way. The right bomb bay door snapped open, catching the brutal slipstream and tearing entirely off its tracks. It fluttered away behind the bomber like a discarded piece of foil. Instantly, 6 tons of incendiary bombs tumbled out of the belly of a square 5-2. They fell away into the gray ocean, raising massive, useless geysers of white water miles below. The physical relief on the aircraft was instantaneous. Stripped of 12,000 pounds of dead weight, the crippled B-29 violently surged upward. Hayes and Sterling were thrown back in their seats as the bomber ballooned 2,000 feet into the air before they could wrestle the nose back down. "Payload away. Doors are." "Well, the doors are gone, Cap." Powell gasped over the intercom, dragging himself back onto the catwalk, his chest heaving. "Good work, Dick. Get back to your station," Hayes replied, feeling the controls. The bomber was still flying sideways, and they were still running on a single good engine, but the horrific sink rate had stopped. They were holding level at 8,500 feet, but the nightmare wasn't over. The sudden surge in altitude had brought them right back into the sights of the remaining Japanese fighters. Humiliated by their staggering losses and infuriated by the bomber's refusal to die, 4 final key 61 Tonys formed up for a coordinated, simultaneous attack from 4 different vectors. "They're boxing us in," Chen said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly register. His thumbs rested heavily on the triggers, his eyes scanning the 4 approaching dots. "Tail gunner, Joey. Are you still with us back there?" For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a weak, strained voice came over the wire. "I'm here, Robbie. I managed to pry the turret track back into place with a fire axe. I have manual control." "Good," Chen said, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth beneath his oxygen mask. "Let's finish this." Wind howled through the shattered fuselage of A*5-2, a relentless, freezing gale that stripped the remaining warmth from the 11 men aboard. Having miraculously shed 6 tons of dead weight, the crippled Boeing B-29 Superfortress clawed at the thin air of 8,000 feet. But the reprieve was desperately short-lived. 4 Kawasaki Ki 61 Tony fighters, the last remnants of the intercepting squadron, had boxed them in. They were circling like wolves around a wounded, bleeding bison, coordinating a simultaneous strike to overwhelm the bomber's defensive guns. Captain Thomas Hayes gripped the heavy yoke, his forearms burning with lactic acid. He and First Lieutenant Acheron Sterling were practically standing on the left rudder pedal, just to keep the bomber from entering an unrecoverable flat spin. With 2 starboard engines completely dead, the third left engine severely damaged, and only the number 2 engine operating at full emergency power, the asymmetric thrust was a physical monster they had to wrestle every single second. "They're coming in on all 4 points of the compass," Staff Sergeant Robert Chen reported from his central fire control blister. His voice was a calm, mechanical rasp over the intercom, belying the absolute terror of the moment. He had abandoned the high-tech computer sites completely. This was now a game of raw geometry and human instinct. "Joey, you take the 6 o'clock. Tommy, Danny, you split the 3 and 9. I'll take the one coming straight down our throat at 12. The Japanese flight leader initiated the attack, pushing his throttle to the firewall. The 4 Tonys collapsed the box, diving in from the front, rear, and both flanks simultaneously. They had finally learned their lesson from the previous engagements. They were bleeding off their speed, coming in slower to match the agonizingly sluggish pace of the B-29, ensuring they wouldn't overshoot. "Hold your fire," Chen commanded, his thumbs resting lightly on the triggers. "Let them commit. Make them think our guns are jammed. Hold." The frontal Tony grew massive in Chen's optic. He could see the flash of the enemy's wing cannons, the tracers reaching out like glowing red fingers. Sparks showered the cockpit as a 20mm shell glanced off the armored glass inches from Hayes's face. "Now!" Chen screamed. He squeezed the triggers. The upper forward turret erupted, spewing a continuous stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Because the Tony had slowed down to aim, it lost its evasive agility. Chen's stream of lead walked directly into the fighter's liquid-cooled engine block. The Tony shuddered, its propeller freezing instantly as the engine seized. It pitched straight up, stalled, and fell backward into the ocean in a smoking death dive. Kill number 11. Simultaneously, the waist gunners unleashed hell. Sergeant Tommy Riley, tracking the fighter on the left, fired a long, sweeping burst that severed the enemy plane's wing root. The wing snapped off cleanly, and the fighter entered a violent, inescapable cartwheel. Kill number 12. Corporal Danny O'Connor, manning the right blister, wasn't as lucky. His target had anticipated the defensive fire and jinked wildly. O'Connor's tracers chewed through empty air. The Tony raked the right side of the B-29, its bullets tearing through the already mangled sheet metal and severing the remaining intercom lines to the aft section. "Danny, did you get him?" Chen yelled, but only static answered. The Tony that had just strafed O'Connor pulled up, banking sharply to circle back for the kill. But as it pulled up, it exposed its underbelly to the tail of the B-29. In the isolated, freezing tail compartment, Sergeant Joey Russo was fighting his own private war. The second ramming attack had warped his turret tracks, and he was aiming his twin, 50 calibers manually, utilizing a fire axe handle he had wedged into the gears for leverage. He was cut off from the intercom, deaf to the world, except for the roar of the wind and the thundering of his own pulse. He saw the Tony pulling up from its strafing run. Russo didn't hesitate. He muscled the heavy turret upward and slammed the firing pedal. The twin heavy machine guns roared, their barrels glowing white-hot. A devastating volley tore through the cockpit of the climbing Tony. The canopy shattered into a million glittering diamonds, and the fighter abruptly flipped over, diving uncontrollably into the Pacific waves. Kill number 13. Only one fighter remained, the one attacking from the dead rear. The pilot of the final key, 61, saw his 3 comrades destroyed in the span of 30 seconds. Driven by a furious, suicidal grief, he didn't break off. He leveled his fighter directly behind the tail of A-52, settling in for a point-blank execution shot. Russo swung his manual turret to face the incoming threat. He pressed the pedal, but his guns clicked empty. He had burned through his ammunition belts. He was completely defenseless. He watched the nose of the Japanese fighter flare as it prepared to fire. Suddenly, a profound and violent shudder ran through the entire airframe of the bomber. Captain Hayes, acting purely on desperation and the feel of the struggling aircraft, violently chopped the throttle on their only good engine and simultaneously deployed the enormous Fowler flaps. The 60-ton bomber slammed on its aerodynamic brakes. Its speed instantaneously plummeted from 140 miles per hour to barely 90. It was a maneuver that should have stalled the aircraft and sent them plunging into the sea. The Japanese pilot, fixated on his target and closing in at 200 miles per hour, had absolutely no time to react. The Ki-61 shot entirely underneath the tail of the B-29, missing the underside of the fuselage by mere inches. The immense, turbulent wash from the bomber's sudden deceleration caught the lightweight fighter, violently flipping it inverted. Before the Japanese pilot could correct the catastrophic stall, Chen, in the top blister, tracked the inverted fighter sliding out from beneath them. He depressed his triggers, emptying the very last of his ammunition reserves into the exposed fuel tanks of the Tony. The fighter disintegrated in a blinding flash of aviation fuel and torn aluminum, the shockwave rocking the bomber one last time. Kill number 14. The sky, suddenly and miraculously, was empty. Silence settled over the intercom, a sudden and profound void that felt heavier than the roar of the cannons. It wasn't a true silence. The freezing wind still howled, mercilessly, through the shattered fuselage of A*5-2, and the remaining engines groaned under an impossible strain. But compared to the deafening chaos of the past 30 minutes, it was absolute. They had just fought the most intense, localized aerial engagement of the Pacific War. They had destroyed 14 Japanese interceptors, 12 shot down by blistering defensive crossfire, and 2 obliterated by their own desperate, suicidal ramming maneuvers. The sky, suddenly and miraculously, was completely empty. Up in the central fire control blister, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen released his death grip on the dual handles of his optical sight. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to ball them into fists to make them stop. Below him, in the waist section, Sergeant Tommy Riley and Corporal Danny O'Connor slumped against the freezing aluminum bulkheads, their breath pluming in the depressurized cabin, surrounded by thousands of spent brass casings that rolled back and forth with every erratic pitch of the dying bomber. But the victory offered no comfort. The adrenaline crash hit the crew like a physical blow, leaving behind only the agonizing realization of their reality. They were 1,000 miles from their base on Saipan, flying an aircraft that had been aerodynamically annihilated. Damage report. Captain Thomas Hayes gasped, his voice barely a raw, ragged whisper over the wire. He was slumped forward against the heavy yoke, sweat freezing in the deep lines of his face. Behind the cockpit, Master Sergeant Bill Gallagher stared at his flight engineer's panel with wide, terrified eyes. The dials were a graveyard of dead needles and flashing warning lights. "We have massive fuel leaks in the right wing," Gallagher replied, his voice shaking uncontrollably as he tried to process the catastrophic failure cascading across his station. "Engine 2 is burning oil at a catastrophic rate. Engine 1 is hanging by its mounts. We have no bomb bay doors, a hole the size of a jeep in the port side, and we are flying on a wing and a prayer." Hayes swallowed hard, tasting blood and bile. "Doc, give me a heading." Second Lieutenant Doc Harrison was on his hands and knees in the navigation compartment. The blast from the second ramming had shattered his desk and blown his primary charts out into the slipstream. Utilizing a simple wooden pencil, a torn scrap of map, and his shattered, cracked compass, he calculated their desperate trajectory. "Heading 180, Captain," Harrison reported, his tone unnervingly calm. "Straight south. If we maintain this speed, we reach Saipan in 6 hours. 6 hours. In a healthy B-29, it was a long, tedious haul. In a bleeding, broken 60-ton brick, it sounded like an eternity. The journey back became a grueling, slow-motion test of human endurance. Hayes and First Lieutenant Acheron Sterling took agonizing 15-minute shifts, physically standing on the left rudder pedal. The asymmetric drag from the destroyed right wing was so immense that if they relaxed their legs for even a fraction of a second, the bomber would instantly snap into a violent, unrecoverable, flat spin. Their calf and thigh muscles cramped so severely that the co-pilot had to relentlessly punch his own legs to keep the muscle fibers firing. Behind them, the temperature inside the unpressurized cabin plummeted to well below freezing. The tropical heat of the morning was a forgotten dream. The wind tore relentlessly through the massive breach in the port side, turning the interior into an icy wind tunnel. Riley, O'Connor, and Chen dragged themselves together in the waist compartment, wrapping their shivering bodies in shredded, oil-stained silk parachutes. They huddled against the trembling bulkheads, their eyes closed, listening to the agonizing groans of the dying Superfortress, waiting for the structural spine to finally snap. 4 hours into the flight, the inevitable happened. The number one engine on the port wing, which had been rattling violently on its fractured mounts, finally gave out. It seized with a terrifying, deafening metallic screech that sent a brilliant shower of orange sparks washing over the left wing. The massive propeller froze in place. They were now flying a heavily damaged 60-ton aircraft on a single, drastically overstressed engine. Without the lift from the port engine, the B-29 instantly lost altitude, sinking out of the sky like a descending elevator. The bomber dropped from 8,000 feet, plunging through the cloud deck, until it leveled out barely 1,000 feet above the rolling swells of the Pacific. They were flying so perilously low that the heavy, salt-laden spray, whipped up by the ocean wind, coated the shattered plexiglass of the cockpit. Through the floorboards, the crew could see the terrifying, slate-gray water churning, waiting to swallow them whole. Eastleigh Field Tower, this is A. Square, 5-2, Sergeant Hank Miller chanted into his radio for the 100th time, his voice hoarse and desperate. He pressed the headset tightly against his ears, praying for something other than static. Mayday, Mayday. We are coming in hot, heavy, and dead. Does anyone read? For a long minute, there was only the hiss of the empty airwaves and the rhythmic, terrifying thrum of their single good engine. Then, a faint, miraculous voice broke through the interference. A. Square. 5-2. This is Isley. We have you on radar. Clear the deck. Crash crews are standing by. Through the hazy, salt-stained windshield, the jagged coral cliffs of Saipan slowly materialized like a mirage rising from the sea. Hayes didn't have the luxury of a standard approach pattern. He couldn't align with the wind. He didn't have the hydraulic pressure to lower the landing gear fully, and his flaps were entirely unresponsive. He was going to have to slam the enormous aircraft onto the crushed coral runway and pray the friction didn't ignite the explosive fumes lingering in their ruptured fuel tanks. "Brace for crash landing," Hayes roared over the intercom, gripping the yoke with the last of his fading strength. The B-29 hit the coral runway of Isley Field at a terrifying 160 miles per hour. Without a fully deployed starboard main gear to support the weight, the right wing immediately dropped. The sheared aluminum scraped violently along the abrasive, crushed white coral. A massive, blinding shower of sparks erupted, instantly engulfing the right side of the aircraft in a terrifying halo of white-hot light. Deprived of all steering control, the bomber spun violently to the right, careening off the designated runway and plunging wildly into the tropical dirt. The remaining landing gear snapped off like dry twigs beneath the immense kinetic weight of the fuselage. The metal screamed, the internal ribs buckled, and for 5 terrifying, bone-jarring seconds, the world was a blinding, deafening chaos of tearing aluminum, shattering glass, and choking red dust. And then, with a final, violent shudder, it stopped. The thick coral dust slowly settled over the twisted, smoking wreckage of what had once been a marvel of modern aviation technology. For a long, terrifying moment, there was absolutely no movement from the mangled hull. The crash crews racing toward the site held their breath. Then, near the crushed cockpit, a jagged piece of the roof fuselage was kicked outward. A bloody, oil-stained hand reached blindly out into the humid air. Captain Thomas Hayes hauled himself from the smoking wreckage, coughing violently into the tropical heat. He was followed, one by Sterling, Chen, Gallagher, and the rest of the battered, bruised, but miraculously alive crew. They stumbled away from the leaking fuel, collapsing onto the warm, solid dirt of Saipan. Covered in grease, blood, and the freezing sweat of a 6-hour nightmare, they turned to look back at the mangled, unrecognizable carcass of A*52. They had brought the ghost ship home. Aviation history is forged in the crucible of impossible mathematics and desperate courage. But few encounters rival the sheer, violent improbability of A*52's final flight. Against a swarm of high-performance interceptors, an irreparably crippled bomber manned by 11 exhausted men managed to destroy 14 enemy fighters, surviving 2 catastrophic mid-air rammings in the process. Their survival was a testament not only to the rugged, over-engineered brilliance of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, but to the unbreakable resolve of the men who flew it. They defied aerodynamic logic, tactical doctrine, and the laws of probability. When the odds dictated their absolute destruction, the crew of A*52 relied on raw instinct, unbroken camaraderie, and an unyielding refusal to die, cementing their terrifying ordeal as one of the most legendary, brutal, and miraculous aerial engagements of the Second World War.